Okay, so moving right along to our next author, we're going to take a look at Rainer Maria Rilke, who is a poet. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to look at some poetry with you. It's been a while. I think Baudelaire and Basho were the only two poets we've studied, and Basho's poetry, the way it was intermixed with prose, is really interesting, but didn't feel to me the way what I usually think of with poetry, with authors like um, Rilke and Baudelaire, who write short lyric poems. And Rilke's poems are incredibly short, but there's so much intensity packed into them. They're truly amazing. He's probably one of my top five poets. And in the next final part of the lecture, we'll look at Pablo Neruda. So we'll actually look at two poets. And hopefully that was a nice break for you, even though poetry demands a different degree, a different type of reading intensity. Having a couple of short lyric poets after Dostoevsky, I hope, was a nice break for you. So let's take a look at Rilke's background and context. He had a pretty unhappy childhood. His mother had experienced the death of his baby sister not long before he was born, and she really missed her daughter, and so she dressed him up as a girl, which is probably not what he wanted, and really, ultimately tells a sad story of some of his family's history. And we can see this into his adulthood as significant in that, he struggled with identity, and some of his poems reflect that. Um, Another reason his earlier years were unhappy is his occupations. He was pretty miserable at the military academy. Business school and working at a law firm were also not good fits for him. Probably the best fit was when he was studying at the University of Prague, but that wasn't his ultimate goal. He always sought a literary career. He always wanted to be a poet. And so he published his first two books of poetry between working these jobs and studying at the university. And what we'll see with Rilke as we continue to look at these context factors is that his life was characterized by two things that moved in jointly in patterns. So the first is relationships, and then the second is his maturation as a poet. So some poets and writers in general, as you study them, have different kind of phases of their careers, you could say, and their truly great works appear in different phases for different reasons. With Rilke, you can see a real progress if you study his poetry, where his poetry gets better as he gets older and more experienced, because I really believe he took what he learned from his experiences in different places throughout the world and continued to really work on his craft and hone his craft. And I said he was influenced by different experiences. So he went and visited a lot of places. I guess that's kind of the third element here is location, and had relationships with different people in those locations. So the people and the places influenced the poems, and those three things kind of matured and developed together. So we're going to look at that sequence of relationships, places, and the poems that emerged from them here. So after his kind of early careers that didn't work out and his early poems that also weren't successful, he, in 1897, fell in love with the married psychoanalyst Lou Andreas Salome. I spelled it wrong, but I believe I'm pronouncing it right. And they had a relationship pretty much his whole life where even when they weren't together through correspondences and whatnot, she influenced him pretty significantly as a thinker. And so one of the first things they did together was go to Russia 2 years later. He accompanied her and her husband on the journey. Strange, I know, but you'll see he was a very strange individual. When they went to Russia, he got to meet Tolstoy, which is really cool and exciting. He was swayed by the Russian mysticism of Tolstoy, which we didn't learn about because we chose Dostoevsky for our main Russian writer, but also the Russian landscape, which we did talk about, the setting of Russia. And so here in Russia, he wrote his first poems that were commercially successful. After that, he married his wife, Clara Westoff. But of all his relationships that we're going to discuss, even though he actually married her, that was actually one of the shortest relationships. For instance, he had a lifelong correspondence with Andreas Salome. They were living together as artists in a colony called Warp Swede, Germany, which was basically kind of a small settlement of people who wanted to just live as artists. But that didn't, like I said, that relationship didn't last very long. After his marriage ended, he went to Paris to work with, actually read a biography of this sculptor, Auguste Rodin, and they became friends. And Rodin, like Andreas Salome, was a huge influence on him. And there he found, the way the textbook says it, I think it says it well, he found the dedication to the technical demands of his craft. So, I think sometimes we think of poetry as someone is just inspired in this moment and they write this beautiful poem kind of on the spot with this sublime inspiration. But in reality, the truth is actually that it takes a great degree of work, lots of revision, because the forms are so technical. And as you can see with Rilke, he's so focused on the nuances of public punctuation, and where he breaks the lines so that the poems have a real feel to them as you read. It took him a long time to hone that craft. So he progressed from having some unsuccessful poems when he was an undergrad and working various jobs to having his first commercially successful poems when he was, learning under Tolstoy in Russia, to finally kind of hitting his stride with a collection he called New Poems, I believe in 1907, when he was working with the sculptor in Paris, Auguste Rodin. In the 4 poems we have in our anthology all come from that collection, New Poems. His next excursion after that, he stayed in 1911 to stay at a place called Dwinnow Castle, when he was the patron of Princess Marie von Thurn. So he was the patron of a princess, and this princess invited him to stay at a castle. That's pretty cool. But he begun what were called the Dwinnow Elegies there, and those are not included in our textbook, but if you ever have the chance, you should read them. They're quite beautiful poems, and they are considered his magnum opus, his greatest achievement. An elegy is like a poem that laments a loss, and so they're sad, reflective poems, but quite beautiful poems. If you like Rilke's style of poetry, you would like the Dwinnow Elegies. But he didn't complete them. They were, you could say, his life's work, arguably, and he wasn't able to finish them because his stay at Dwinnow Castle was interrupted a few years later when he was drafted into the military and forced to serve in the German military during World War I. And that was just a horrible experience for him. He clearly was not a good fit. He didn't believe in the war, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was quite depressing. And he had begun the Dwinnow Elegies, but they were such a large undertaking, he hadn't finished them. And so he had concerns that he wouldn't be able to finish them. But fortunately, he was discharged from military service in 1916. And over the next 7 years, he completed not only the Dwinnow Elegies, but another set of poems of sonnets called Sonnets to Orpheus. Those were in 1922, and the Dwinnow Elegies in 1923. And those are considered his master achievements. The excerpts from New Poems, or the short poems from the New Poems collection, are in our textbook because they're the most accessible of his work, but really his greatest achievement are the Dwinnow Elegies and Sonnets to Orpheus. So if you like Rilke, I encourage you to seek those out and read them. They're excellent. And so fortunately, despite his concerns when he was drafted, because he only had to spend a few years in the military, he was able to finish them over the last years of his career before he died of leukemia in 1926. The content, the threads. What I'm going to do here is actually outline Rilke's philosophy compared to, say, earlier poets. Rilke is so recent, early 20th century, that because of his letters and other things he wrote, we're really able to piece together his philosophy of what poetry should be. So I'm going to outline that for you, and then we'll take a look at 3 of the poems and see how that philosophy shows up in the poems. So the core thing, the key idea of his philosophy of poetry was that he wrote thing poems. That's the best English translation we can render. I've included the German word here. I'm not going to venture to pronounce it because I'm under no obligation to try to pronounce it. But I included the German word because sometimes we can't render translation perfectly. Not every language has a corresponding word for every word in another language, especially when you have, clever poets who are just making things up. But thing poems is a fairly appropriate title because, as you can see in each poem, the archaic torso of Apollo, the panther, the swan, the Spanish dancer, each one focuses on a specific thing or object. And so he was all about the physical reality of objects. He thought objects had an absolute otherness, a thing-like nature that kind of separated them from people in some important ways, this is just kind of scratching the surface of his theory of thing poems. We'll go into more detail as we go along here, but a couple other kind of big ideas first before we look in more detail specifically at the thingness of the things in his poems. So he saw art as an essentially religious activity. To my knowledge of his biography, he did not adhere to Christianity or Judaism or a specific religion, but he was an incredibly spiritual poet. And I think when you read his poems, his spirituality comes through, and they have that effect on me when I read them, where I'm not just reading something, it's a bigger experience than that. And so he considered his art, his crafting of poetry, his religion, I guess you could say. He felt writing poetry was a spiritual experience. He's quoted as having been seeking a comprehensive vision of cosmic unity. So I have the word modernism in parentheses there because if you read that, comprehensive vision of cosmic unity, that really sounds like how the textbook defines modernism, right? A search for a new cohesive society to replace the one that was destroyed that we could never regain with the onset of modernity. But that's almost like an earthly kind of society in the definition of modernism. So I think Rilke is one of the best writers of the modern period. We often call them high modernists because we've talked about how they're avant-garde. And you think of people like Wallace Stevens and T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and Carlos Williams. But really, Rilke, he had a cosmic vision. He saw a spirituality in his poems that those other writers that we normally think of as high modernists didn't necessarily see. And so he wasn't just trying to unite all people. He was trying to unite, you could say, all things in the universe, which is a grand goal. But again, I think it may sound lofty to you, but I think when you read his poetry, it's a spiritual experience that's fairly unparalleled. There's only a few other poets I'd put above him, and those other ones aren't modernists. So now that we've covered kind of these 3 big points of his philosophy, let's go specifically into the thing poems aspect, because that's kind of the new idea that's really unique to him. And define it in a little bit more detail. So he saw ancient art objects, for instance, like the archaic torso, as detached from history. If they were old enough, you didn't have to consider them in their historical context. So they could kind of be things in and for themselves. And for him, that brought them to life. He can experience in the moment what the archaic torso was like without having to consider the whole Roman history, and that's a very kind of sublime experience for him. They're alive with a strange vitality when under the poet's gaze. So the act of writing poetry about them is very important. The panther, the swan, the torso, the dancer, they're important, but they take on even greater meaning when the poet contemplates them. It sounds kind of self-focused, and it is, because much of modernism was very self-focused. I mean, if you look at Joyce, who's considered the greatest high modernist, all of his writing was about himself and his growth as an artist. And so, as self-focused as this sounds here, it's actually probably kind of less so when you compare him with the other high modernists. And it goes way beyond that, because the physical presence of these things transcends words. Like I was saying, it's a spiritual experience when you read his poetry, so it goes beyond words. And that challenges the viewer. We feel or look puny compared to the torso, which is big, or even the panther, or even the swan, which is not as intimidating as a panther or a torso, but the way these objects take on a vitality through his poetry makes them immense, and that diminishes our existence, makes us smaller, which is a good thing because it's humility. So on the one hand, the emphasis on the poet's gaze sounds unhumble, but in actuality, his goal is to humble his readers, because he has this cosmic vision, and unity takes humility. Kind of going on some more kind of important thoughts here on his philosophy of poetry. He was haunted by the incompleteness of human experience and the passage of time. I mean, he served in the military in World War I. Like all of our other authors so far in this lecture, he saw some of the horrors of modernity up close, and so he was haunted by those experiences. And again, I think this is why he strived for a cosmic unity, a spiritual kind of an approach to poetry, something larger than life. And so he infuses these objects, these things, with ideas, emotions, and values. So very human qualities. Ideas, emotions, and values is an interesting question, because there's always the debate of, what is the intelligence of an animal? What is the capacity of an animal to suffer? And we see great suffering in the Panther poem. And, that question has spurred a lot of movements for animal rights and things like that. But Rilke is doing something even more intense than that, I would argue. I mean, that's very important, but like I said, this is a spiritual thing he's doing here. So not only is he arguing that an animal can have ideas and emotions and values and experience suffering like a human, he's prescribing like a spiritual element, mapping that on to the animal. So personification is a poetic term. I mentioned before you need to be familiar with a lot of the poetic terms like metaphor, etc. for a class like this, and I'm assuming you've already had that background and intro to poetry. So personification, but it's more than just personification. Personification is where you take like a non-human thing, like an animal or a statue, and prescribe human qualities to it. But he is like a higher, newer form of personification. No one has personified non-human things to the extent that Rilke does. So he really, with his Thing poems, he really invented a new brand of poetry here, and it was quite influential. And while his influence has been observed by scholars, I don't think it's been significant enough. I'm surprised more poets haven't emulated him. So his poems are so short that I want to just read them because they're short, they're succinct, but they're brilliant and beautiful. And as we go, when it seems appropriate to break, I'll try to kind of show where the threads show up, where his poetic philosophy shows up. And I'm just doing 3 of them for the sake of time and to leave a little bit to you. It's tempting to do all 4 because they're so short, but like I said, I always want to leave a little bit for you to do, and I'm sure you can get other things out of these 3 poems as well. I mean, they're great poems. So the archaic torso of Apollo. We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power otherwise. The curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thigh to that dark center where procreation flared. So here, the punctuation is important. We have a stanza break that I should have left a space here to show between lines 4 and 5. And so he uses fairly conventional style. I mean, this isn't free verse or anything, but he does a lot with punctuation that's really interesting. Remember, with poetry, you have to pay attention to the punctuation. So when he says, like a lamp in which his gaze, now turned low, gleams in all its power, otherwise the curved breast could not dazzle you so. He's not ending lines with the punctuation breaks you normally have. He ends the stanza and moves on to the next stanza in the same sentence. So he's really drawing you in to the poem, into this experience, the spiritual experience he's having with this thing. And what we see here is how art detached from history still glows. It's the archaic torso of Apollo. So it's very old. But if you look at those first 4 lines, it's just the torso, right? There's no head. But he basically transfers the head to the torso and says, is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp in which his gaze now turned low, gleams in all its power. So you're drawn in, you have to go to that second stanza to complete this thought. But the thought is that even without the head, it still gleams in all its power. So something shines even more when you can take it out of its historical context, which you can. He's arguing with the statue of a torso because it's archaic, it's old, enough to be detached from history. So there's some of his philosophy shows up. Let's look at the rest of the poem, the last 2 stanzas. Otherwise the stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders, and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not from all the borders of itself burst like a star, for here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. So we talked about his search for the search of modernism for a new cohesive society. I think we have that here because you have a rare moment of him directly declaring an imperative. You must change your life. But to come back to the idea from threads 3 and 7, the torso and moreover his spiritual experience with it as a poet is so immense that in its presence we're humbled. And so we know we must change. It feels very much here like Diary of a Madman when the madman, the narrator, is making the argument, you can change, you can change. He's saying we can. But what does it take to convince people, like the people in Diary of a Madman, who aren't seeing the truth, who aren't seeing that they're brutal, who are denying that? What does it convince them that they need change? What can convince them of that? Something as immense as the spiritual experience the speaker here has with this torso. So the immensity of the object from the past forces us to reconsider our existence and prompts us to change our ways. So if you want to sum up Rilke in a nutshell, I would say the only way true change can happen is from realizing we're small. True change takes humility is the lesson of Rilke's poetry. And that sounds like a thesis. And so since we're looking at 3 separate poems here, what I'm going to do is kind of give you my thesis on each one as we go rather than saving them all for the final slide, which we would do if we were looking at just one work like a short story or a play. All right, The Panther, which is a poem that has always fascinated me because I have always felt uneasy at zoos, and most people like zoos. So I always kind of felt like a weirdo. And then I read this poem and I was like, that's it. That's why I feel weird at zoos. And I lived in Phoenix, Arizona while I was getting my PhD at Arizona State. And one time I took my children to the Phoenix Zoo and I saw a jaguar in a very small cage away from the other feline-like animals. And seeing the jaguar not be able to run fast, I was teaching this poem in a world literature class there right around the same time, and it just really hit home for me. So here's the panther. His vision from the constantly passing bars is grown so weary that it holds no more. To him it seems there are 1,000 bars, and behind 1,000 bars no world. So this is a great example of a thing poem with an object personified because the panther experiences imprisonment as a human would, and through this depiction of the panther, Rilke elicits our sympathy for the panther. So he has no world left. His world is running as fast as he can in a jungle. He can't do that behind bars in the Paris Zoo. And so, I mean, that's really sad. But the language to convey it is beautiful, and he's humanizing the panther. His vision holds no more. For him there is no world. Right. The padding gait of flexibly strong strides that in the very smallest circle turns is like a dance of strength around a center in which stupefied a great will stands. So this is the idea of the physical presence of the thing, the object under consideration in the poem, is so immense. It's immense when you have the combination of the thing and the poet. The thing, like a panther, is immense and intimidating no matter what. I mean, if there was a panther in my office right now, I'd be freaking out. But it takes on an even greater dimension when the poet writes about it, because the poet can humanize it. It can infuse it with emotions and ideas and values that maybe that animal possesses those things, but the human can't necessarily see them without the help of the poet as a guide to kind of flesh those out for us. And so the combination of the thing and the poet writing about the thing is so immense that it overwhelms us, it humbles us. And I might feel a little bit humbled when I read the archaic torso of Apollo, but I feel incredibly humbled when I read this poem, because Rilke couples the immense power, strength, speed, and intensity of the panther with his imprisoned, stupefied nature to show us the tragic horror and suffering of his captivity. I mean, a panther is one of the most amazing creatures in the world, but it can't be amazing behind bars. And that encapsulates modernism, or modernity, that, shows us suffering. It can be a metaphor for so many things, and it in of itself is an important thing, a tragedy to take note of. So it's a powerful, challenging, humbling poem, and that's what's about it. And in the last stanza, the speaker says, "Only sometimes the curtain of the pupil soundlessly parts, then an image enters, goes through the tension stillness of the limbs, and in the heart ceases to be." So here Rilke's really personifying or really humanizing the panther, like we discussed, because he shows the interiority of the panther. I mentioned how writers focused on humans rather than animals, like Joyce and Woolf, and showed their minds, showed what the characters were thinking. There was this great emphasis on interiority. Here you have Rilke doing the same thing with an animal. He shows literally what happens, that even though he's behind these bars and has no world, sometimes, once in a while, an image does enter, goes through the tension stillness of the limbs. So we see once again how the panther can't move the way he's supposed to be able to move. And that's tragic. And so the whole body processes the image that's entered through the eye, but in the heart ceases to be. And so we have the chaotic thought patterns of a panther here, just like how in Joyce and Woolf we have the chaotic thought patterns of Stephen Dedalus or Clarissa Dalloway. So, that's why I say high modernism. Rilke is doing something here that's quite impressive, that's gone unnoticed or not noticed enough. All right, the swan. The toiling to go through something yet undone, heavily and as though in bonds, is like the ungainly gait of the swan. So again, you have that pause with something yet undone, unfinished. And so that's the incompleteness of human existence that haunted Rilke. And so the swan's slow gait on land resembles the struggles of modernity. We're all kind of slouching through this world, this chaotic, troublesome modern world on the land. And there's a great punctuation extension, lack of a punctuation break between the second and third stanza. So I'm just going to read the rest of his poem in its entirety, and then on the last slide we'll talk about the meaning. In dying, this no longer grasping of that ground on which we daily stand, like his anxious letting himself down into the waters which receive him smoothly, and which, as though happy and bygone, draw back underneath him flow on flow, while he, infinitely still and sure, ever more maturely and more royally and more seemly, deigns to draw along. So I recommend you open your book and have the poem in front of you, since the words aren't on the screen anymore, because I'm going to go through some really important stuff here. I think these poems are structured sequentially in Rilke's collection, New Poems, and they build thematically to a crescendo here. That's why I've chosen to focus on these three and kind of leave Spanish Dancer alone, although it's a great poem. So you have Rilke's philosophy laid out in Archaic Torso of Apollo, and Panther, through our sympathy for the Panther, you have that philosophy on display again, but in a way that elicits our sympathy for a suffering creature, so it drives the philosophy home even more. And in the Swan, you have, through another focus on an animal, but not necessarily one who's suffering, not in the same way, you have, I would say, an answer to the questions raised by the other poems. So first off, we should just note that Rilke ascribes human emotions, such as anxiety and happiness, to the non-human animals and objects of the poem, mainly the swan and the water. So again, that thing theory coming through. And then now we'll look at a few bullet points that show us how his philosophy develops and gives an answer over the course of these lines. The start of the poem, the swan's awkward movements on land, represent humanity's struggle with modernity. The land is not the natural place for the swan. It's not where the swan is supposed to be. But the swan leaves the earth. He goes from this awkward gait to a smooth journey across the water. So the water is really where the swan belongs. And you have this important kind of visual of him leaving the earth. Those first lines of the second stanza. In dying, this no longer grasping of that ground on which we daily stand. So letting go of the ground. But if you're reading that and I took away the title, you think you might be hearing about like an eagle or something. But no, the swan goes on the water rather than in the air. So his transition off the earth is a condescension of sorts. So you might ask at this point, is Rilke talking about death? Is he advocating for death? I don't think so. He's certainly not advocating that anyone should end their life. But what he is talking about death. Remember, ultimately he believed that writing poetry was a spiritual pursuit. And he wanted to believe or wanted to find a cosmic vision of unity. And I think that's what we have finally, I said in the crescendo here. The Swan poem is the crescendo. So we finally have that cosmic vision. I think he's talking about a spiritual transition. Whether that's to an afterlife or something else, because like I said, he didn't identify with one specific religion, leaving the earth, entering a more cosmic realm is the transition necessary to combat the suffering of modernity. But it's a condescension. We have to make ourselves low. In other words, the only way to transition to the afterlife, to a better life, is to be humble. Because the swan deigns to draw along at the end of the poem, deigns to move along. So he's not taking off in the sky, he's going from the land to the water. That physical movement is important. So to respond to the struggles of modernity, we must leave the earthly plane for a more spiritual realm, but do so by making ourselves low. Again, I don't think he's advocating immediate action. He's saying that transition, this life is a struggle, but I think he's saying we're strangers here. We're meant for something more, something greater than just an earthly existence plagued by modernity. So he's not saying hurry off to it. The journey is great. The journey is important too, but take hope. There is something better. And how do we get there? By being humble. We make ourselves low by empathizing, sympathizing with the struggles of a panther. And that's what we do to earn or to make it to a better place, to the place where we truly belong, as opposed to this place of suffering where we are aliens, much like the swan is on the ground.